Britain had no steel in 1940, so they built Spitfires from pots and pans. January 17, 1940, a frost-coated Thursday morning in Birmingham, England. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, and the sky hung low like a gray tarpaulin stretched too thin. In the cramped kitchen of a terraced house on Birchfield Road, a woman named Margaret Ashworth stood at her stove, staring at the copper-bottomed saucepan she'd received as a wedding gift 11 years earlier. Her fingers traced the dented rim, remembering the Sunday roasts, the porridge for her 2 sons, the jam she'd boiled down each summer from the garden brambles. Outside, the milk bottles on the doorstep had frozen solid. Inside, the BBC Home Service crackled from the wireless in the corner, and the voice was calm, measured, impossibly polite. The Ministry of Aircraft Production, it said, was asking for aluminum, pots, pans, kettles, anything that could be spared, for the Spitfires. Margaret looked at the saucepan again. Then she walked to the front door, opened it to the cold, and placed the pan on the step beside the frozen milk. She did not cry. She simply went back inside, put the kettle on for tea, and waited. Across Britain, in 10,000 kitchens just like hers, the same small ritual was taking place. A nation was dismantling its domestic life, piece by piece, and offering it to the sky. In the first winter of the Second World War, Britain faced a crisis that was not yet written in the headlines, not yet visible in the smoking ruins of bombed cities or the wreckage of ships in the North Atlantic. It was a crisis of material, of supply, of the hard, the unglamorous arithmetic that determines whether a nation can fight or must surrender. By the end of 1939, the British Empire was the largest political entity on Earth, spanning a quarter of the globe, controlling the seas, commanding the loyalty of millions. But it was also an empire built on imported steel, imported oil, imported food. And now, with the German Kriegsmarine prowling the Atlantic and the industrial heartlands of Europe falling one by one under the Wehrmacht's advance, the supply lines were tightening like nooses. The Royal Air Force needed fighters. Desperately. The Spitfire, designed by Reginald Mitchell and produced by Supermarine Aviation, was already proving itself a marvel of engineering. Elliptical wings, a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and a turn radius that could outdance the Messerschmitt Bf 109 in the right hands. But a Spitfire required aluminum. Lots of it. The airframe alone demanded nearly half a ton of the lightweight, corrosion-resistant metal. Aluminum for the fuselage, the wings, the control surfaces. Aluminum that Britain did not have in sufficient quantities. Aluminum that, in peacetime, had been imported from Norway, from Canada, from places now cut off or too far away to rely upon. Steel Britain had. The forges of Sheffield, the foundries of Glasgow, the rolling mills of South Wales, these could produce steel by the thousands of tons. But steel was heavy. A fighter plane built from steel would be a lumbering, sluggish thing, unable to climb fast enough, turn tight enough, survive long enough. The Germans knew this. They had been stockpiling aluminum since the mid-1930s, preparing for a war of machines and speed. Some of the Luftwaffe's factories were humming with production. By the spring of 1940, Germany was producing fighters at a rate that outstripped Britain's by a factor of 2 to 1, and Britain's stockpiles of aluminum were running dry. This was the arithmetic of survival. This was the equation that kept Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding awake at night, pacing the halls of RAF Fighter Command, calculating losses against production, pilots against planes, time against invasion. The numbers did not lie. If Britain could not build Spitfires, it could not defend its skies. If it could not defend its skies, it could not survive. And so, in the gray winter of 1940, the British government did something unprecedented. It asked its people to give up their pots and pans. Yet the campaign was announced on the BBC and in the newspapers with the kind of understated urgency that the British had perfected over centuries of crisis. Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, was a Canadian-born newspaper magnate with a face like a clenched fist and a voice like gravel in a bucket. He did not mince words. "We need aluminum," he said. "We need it now. We need every scrap of it you can spare. Your old saucepans, your kettles, your jelly molds, your picture frames. Bring them to the collection points. Bring them to the Women's Voluntary Service. Bring them to your local council. We will turn them into Spitfires. We will turn them into wings." It was a gamble. It was also a stroke of propaganda genius. Did Beaverbrook understood what the bureaucrats and the economists sometimes forgot? That people do not fight for abstractions. They do not fight for GDP or for strategic objectives. They fight for something they can see, something they can touch, something that connects their small, private sacrifices to a larger, public cause. A housewife in Birmingham could not storm a beach or fly a fighter plane, but she could give up her saucepan, and in giving it up, she could feel that she was part of the fight. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, collection depots across the country were buried under small mountains of aluminum. Pots and pans, yes, but also biscuit tins, cigarette cases, lipstick tubes, hair curlers, golf clubs, garden furniture, even ornamental gates and railings stripped from parks and private estates. Yet the Women's Voluntary Service organized the logistics with military precision, sorting the donations, loading them onto trucks, transporting them to the foundries and smelters where they would be melted down and reformed into ingots of raw aluminum. Newspapers ran photographs of smiling housewives handing over their kitchenware, of children dragging wagons piled high with pots, of entire streets stripped of their iron railings. The headlines were triumphant. "Britain's kitchens fight back. From saucepans to Spitfires, the People's Air Force." But beneath the propaganda, beneath the cheerful photographs and the stirring rhetoric, there was a deeper, harder truth. The people who gave up their pots and pans were not naive. They knew what it meant. They knew that aluminum saucepans were expensive, and that replacing them after the war, if there was an after the war, would be difficult, perhaps impossible. They knew that cooking without proper equipment meant longer hours in the kitchen, meals that were less nutritious, less varied, less comforting. They knew that the small domestic rituals that had once provided a sense of order and normalcy, the Sunday roast, the evening tea, the birthday cake, were being sacrificed. But they gave anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable. This was not the sacrifice of soldiers. Soldiers expected to give their lives. They trained for it, prepared for it, accepted it as part of the bargain they made when they put on the uniform. This was the sacrifice of ordinary people, who had never expected to be part of a war, who had never imagined that their kitchens would become battlefields, or their saucepans weapons. And yet, when the call came, they answered. By the summer of 1940, the factories were working around the clock. At the Supermarine Works in Southampton, at the Castle Bromwich factory in Birmingham, at the smaller workshops and repair depots scattered across the south of England, the Spitfires were taking shape. The aluminum from the pots and pans was melted down in vast crucibles, purified, alloyed with copper and magnesium to increase its strength, then cast into sheets and extrusions. The sheets were stamped and riveted into fuselage panels. The extrusions were shaped into wing spars and ribs. Every Spitfire that rolled off the production line in the summer of 1940 carried within it the ghosts of 1,000 kitchens, the small, private sacrifices of 1,000 families. The men and women who worked in the factories understood this. They understood that the metal they were shaping had once been part of someone's home, someone's life. It gave the work a weight, a meaning that went beyond wages or patriotism. They were not just building planes, they were building a defense, a future, a promise that the small, ordinary things, the Sunday roast, the evening tea, the birthday cake, would one day return, but the Germans did not know this, and in not knowing, they made a fatal miscalculation. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe came. They came in waves, hundreds of bombers and fighters streaming across the channel, targeting the airfields, the radar stations, the factories, the cities. The Battle of Britain had begun. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, was confident. Yet his intelligence reports told him that the RAF was running out of planes, running out of pilots, running out of time. One more push, one more week of relentless bombing, and the British would break. The invasion barges were already assembling in the French ports. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, was days away. But the RAF did not break. Day after day, the Spitfires and Hurricanes rose to meet the bombers. Day after day, the young pilots, boys really, most of them barely out of school, climbed into their cockpits, strapped themselves in, and flew into the fire. They fought with a desperation born not of training or tactics, but of the knowledge that there was nowhere to retreat, no fallback position, no second line of defense. If they failed, if the Luftwaffe broke through, the war was over. Britain was over. And the planes kept coming. That was the miracle that the Germans could not understand. They shot down Spitfires by the dozen, watched them spiral into the Channel or crash in flames across the green fields of Kent and Sussex. But the next day, there were more. And the day after that, still more. The production lines did not stop. The factories did not run out of aluminum, because the people had given their pots and pans. The German pilots sitting in their cockpits above the Channel, waiting for the order to dive, could not have known this. They could not have known that the Spitfire climbing toward them, its Merlin engine roaring, its 8 machine guns spitting tracer fire, had once been a wedding gift, a Christmas present, a family heirloom. They could not have known that the British were not just defending an island. But they were defending the right to live ordinary lives, to have Sunday roasts and evening tea and birthday cakes. They were defending the future that Margaret Ashworth had imagined when she placed her saucepan on the doorstep that cold January morning. By the end of September, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,700 aircraft. The RAF had lost fewer than 1,000. The German bomber crews, exhausted and demoralized, were pulled back from the daylight raids. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. Hitler turned his gaze eastward, toward the Soviet Union, and Britain, bloodied but unbroken, survived. But the cost was not measured only in planes and pilots. It was measured in the small, private losses that never made the newspapers, never appeared in the official histories. The families who cooked their meals in makeshift pans, who learned to make do with less, who carried the memory of what they had given. The women who stood in their kitchens after the war, staring at the new, mass-produced saucepans from the government surplus stores, knowing they were not the same, knowing they could never be the same. The truth about the aluminum drive, the truth that was not widely known until years later, was that much of the aluminum collected from the public was never used in Spitfires. The factories had their own supply chains, their own sources of industrial-grade aluminum. The pots and pans, once melted down, were often too contaminated, too mixed with other metals, to meet the strict specifications required for aircraft construction. Some of it was used in less critical components, in ground equipment, in training aircraft. And some of it was simply stockpiled and forgotten, but this does not diminish the sacrifice, because the aluminum drive was never really about the metal. It was about the willingness to give. It was about the belief that ordinary people, in their small, ordinary ways, could make a difference. It was about the idea that a nation at war is not just its soldiers and sailors and airmen, but everyone, every family, every kitchen. The British government understood this. Lord Beaverbrook understood this. And so they asked for pots and pans not because they desperately needed them, but because they needed the people to feel that they were part of the fight. And the people, understanding this, gave anyway. There is a photograph taken in the autumn of 1940 that captures this strange, quiet heroism. It shows a Spitfire pilot. He's no more than 20 years old, standing beside his plane at a forward airfield somewhere in Kent. He is smiling, squinting into the low sun, his parachute harness still strapped to his chest. Behind him, a ground crew is refueling the Spitfire, patching the bullet holes in the wing, reloading the ammunition belts. The pilot's name was Flight Lieutenant Jeffrey Wellham, and he would survive the war, would live into his 90s, would write a memoir that became one of the great testaments of the Battle of Britain. But in that moment, in that photograph, he is just a boy, tired and exhilarated, standing beside a machine that had been built from the donated hopes of a nation. Years later, in an interview, Wellham was asked what he thought about when he climbed into the cockpit. He said he thought about his mother, and he thought about the house in Cornwall where he had grown up, the kitchen with the old Aga stove, the smell of bread baking, the sound of his mother's voice calling him in for tea. He said he thought about the ordinary, everyday things that he was fighting to preserve. He said he never forgot that the plane he was flying, the machine that kept him alive, had been built not just by engineers and factory workers, but by the collective will of people he would never meet, people who had given up their saucepans and kettles and jelly molds so that he could fly. This is the symbolism that runs through the story of Britain in 1940. The saucepan, the humble, unglamorous saucepan. It is not a sword or a shield. It is not a flag or a monument. It is a tool for making soup, for boiling potatoes, for cooking porridge on a cold morning. And it is the most ordinary object imaginable. And yet in the hands of people who understood that survival was not just a matter of guns and bombs, but of collective sacrifice, it became something more. It became a weapon. It became a symbol of resilience, of the refusal to surrender, of the belief that even the smallest contribution mattered. The Germans had their own symbols. They had the swastika, the eagle, the Iron Cross. They had the imagery of strength and domination, of blood and soil, of a 1,000-year Reich, but they did not have the saucepan. They did not have the idea that a nation's strength could come not from conquest or ideology, but from the willingness of ordinary people to give up the small comforts of their lives for a larger cause. And in the end, this made all the difference. By the end of 1940, Britain had produced over 1,900 Spitfires. By the end of the war, that number would rise to over 20,000. The factories would eventually receive shipments of high-grade aluminum from Canada, from the United States, from the vast industrial capacity of the Allied nations. The pots and pans were no longer needed, but the idea they represented, the spirit they embodied, remained. It became part of the mythology of the war, part of the story that the British told themselves about who they were and what they had endured. There is a danger, of course, in mythology. There is a danger in turning history into folklore, in smoothing over the rough edges, the failures, the compromises. The aluminum drive was propaganda, and propaganda always simplifies, always distorts. Not every saucepan became a Spitfire, and not every sacrifice made a tangible difference. And yet, the fact remains that people gave. They gave knowing that it might not matter, that their small contribution might be lost in the vastness of the war effort, and they gave anyway. Because they believed or wanted to believe that it mattered, and in believing, they made it matter. The summer of 1940 was the closest Britain came to defeat. If the Luftwaffe had succeeded, if the RAF had been destroyed, if Operation Sea Lion had gone forward, the history of the 20th century would have been unimaginably different. Europe would have remained under Nazi control. The Soviet Union might have fallen. The United States might never have entered the war. The world we live in now, with all its flaws and failures, would not exist. But the Luftwaffe did not succeed. The RAF was not destroyed. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, not even the main reason, but one of the reasons, is that a woman named Margaret Ashworth and 10,000 others like her stood in their kitchens on a cold January morning and decided to give up their saucepans. This is the legacy of 1940. Not just the heroism of the pilots, though their courage was real and undeniable. Not just the brilliance of the engineers, though the Spitfire was a masterpiece of design. But the quiet, unglamorous sacrifice of ordinary people who understood that war is not just fought by soldiers, but by everyone, and that the small things, the saucepans and kettles and jelly molds, can become the foundation of survival. After the war, there were attempts to return aluminum to the people who had donated it. The government offered vouchers, small payments, gestures of gratitude. But most people never claimed them. They didn't want the money. They didn't want the recognition. They had given their pots and pans because it was the right thing to do, because they believed in something larger than themselves, and that was enough. In the decades that followed, the Spitfire became an icon. It appeared on stamps and coins, in films and documentaries, in the collective memory of a nation that had been tested and had not broken. And every time someone looked at a Spitfire, every time they saw the graceful elliptical wings and the sleek, deadly fuselage, they were looking, whether they knew it or not, at the accumulated sacrifices of 1,000 kitchens. There is a small museum in Birmingham now, not far from Birchfield Road, where Margaret Ashworth once lived. It contains artifacts from the war: ration books, gas masks, propaganda posters, pieces of bombed buildings. And in one corner, displayed in a simple glass case, is a dented copper-bottomed saucepan. There is no label, no explanation, just the pan, sitting quietly under the lights, a relic of a time when ordinary objects became extraordinary. Visitors walk past it without noticing. They are drawn to the more dramatic exhibits, the uniforms and weapons, the photographs of burning cities and triumphant soldiers. But sometimes, someone stops. Someone sees the saucepan and pauses, and in that moment, they understand. They understand that history is not just made by the great and the powerful, by the generals and the politicians. It is made by people like Margaret Ashworth, who stood in her kitchen on a cold January morning and chose to give. The lesson of 1940 is not that sacrifice guarantees victory. It does not. Wars are won by many factors, by strategy and logistics, by technology and intelligence, by luck and timing. But sacrifice matters. It matters because it binds people together, because it transforms individuals into a collective, because it creates a sense of shared purpose that cannot be quantified or measured, but is nonetheless real. The Germans understood power. They understood efficiency. They understood the machinery of war, but they did not understand this. They did not understand that a nation willing to give up its saucepans was a nation that would not surrender. And in the end, that misunderstanding cost them the war. Today, the last of the Spitfires still fly. They appear at air shows, at commemorations, at ceremonies honoring the men and women who fought in the skies over Britain. They are beautiful machines, elegant and deadly, and they carry with them the weight of history. But they also carry something else. They carry the memory of the pots and pans, of the kettles and jelly molds, of the small, ordinary sacrifices that made survival possible. And if you listen closely, as the Merlin engine roars and the Spitfire climbs into the sky, you can almost hear it, the faint, persistent clatter of a copper-bottomed saucepan falling onto a doorstep on a cold January morning and changing the course of history.